coming up from the 14th chapter of Matthew, verses 13 to 21, a familiar great story. Jesus left Nazareth by boat and went to a deserted place to be alone. The crowds heard of this and followed him from their towns on foot. When Jesus disembarked and saw the vast throng, his heart was moved with pity, and he healed their sick. As evening drew on, the disciples approached Jesus and said, "This is a deserted place, and it is already late. Dismiss the crowds so they can go to the villages and buy some food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "There is no need for them to disperse. Give them something to eat yourselves." "We have nothing here," they replied, "but 5 loaves and a couple of fish." "Bring them here," Jesus said. Then he ordered the crowds to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven, blessed the food, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, who in turn gave it to the people. All those present ate their fill. The fragments remaining, when gathered up, filled 12 baskets. About 5,000 families were fed. How is our pastor going to explain that?
Well, I'm going to start with a story with Fran in it. So as Fran was entering the parking lot and we were chatting, because I had picked up her reading by mistake in the office, I cut her off and said, "I have your reading already." And she said, "Isn't it a great story about the 5,000? I scratched my head and said, "I think Matthew says 4,000. And then I looked at the reading here and remembered that from the Inclusive Bible, it helps us out a bit because Matthew ends with, "There were 4,000 men, not counting women and children." But I think those who translated for the Inclusive Bible, 5,000 seems a rather small number for women and children when there were 4,000 men. I think we can probably imagine 8,000, 10,000. Can you imagine all those people gathered round? But what confounds me is when I was reading the sentence, "We have nothing here, comma," they replied, "but 5 loaves and a couple of fish." Now, for English teachers, it's all about grammar and where commas go in periods. And some translations have, they replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and a couple of fish." But in this translation, "We have nothing here, comma." And I wonder how often in our lives or we have experienced those situations when we say we have nothing else to give. Now, I know that Mountain Rise is a very generous congregation and that we often give and give. But I have to confess, there are times where I still have a little bit within me that's cynical. For my first years of ministry in Chicago and in the inner city of Chicago, there are always people wanting something, wanting some money, wanting some tokens for the the subway. And sometimes I had nothing. Seriously, nothing in my wallet. No, but then there were times where I did have something. But still, my cynicism is like, well, how are they going to spend this money? And so I'd say, "So you're hungry, so let's walk down the street to McDonald's and I'll have lunch with you, it sort of gave me this good feeling that I was really helping out. But then I'd often wonder, as we talked through lunch, and if they really needed food and money, perhaps I was feeding them only, but they had talked about their children, the mother. I'm wondering, could I have spent more than $5 to feed one? Could I have been a little bit more generous? And I think we all struggle at times with how much to give. But we know those situations when we hear ourselves saying internally and the rest of the world, we have nothing else to give. Several years ago, each spring break, while I was working near the campus of Michigan State University, I would take a group of students to Nicaragua on a mission service trip. And we would explore different themes. And one year we were in the community of Yolina. Now, Yolina was beyond the end of the road. It was to the east, and we would get to the town, which had already taken us about 6 hours on the back of a work truck to get there, which was sort of fun, but now I realize, oh, how dangerous that was. Hitting potholes at the speed of 55 miles an hour, sometimes, but often much, much slower because roads were there and not there. But before there was Yolina, the road ends, high grass growing, and you could barely see tire tracks. And this large work truck with university students on the back plowed another 45 minutes through the grass. And we arrived at the community of Yolina. It was a very poor community, but they welcomed us with open arms. And I was also a big fan of homestays, that we don't all stay clustered together, that we actually live with families. And on this particular trip, many people opened their homes. But there's one incident that still sticks in my mind is one student every morning when we would gather back after breakfast with our families would complain is that she was sleeping in the worst bed ever. And her roommate who shared the bed would just sort of roll her eyes. But I decided it was best not to say anything at this point. But each morning the ritual continued. On our last day before we left, we all had breakfast with our families. But for one student, the family with whom he was staying and sleeping on the dirt floor, the family slaughtered their only pig so that he could have a grand breakfast. He was taken aback. He could not imagine their only meat they slaughtered so he could have a bit of ham with breakfast. But the slaughtering and of the meat was in humid Nicaragua. Meat doesn't keep long. And so this generosity spread out throughout the community so that all could eat. And as the student was telling us this, as we were gathering, the one student said again, I have slept in one of the worst beds ever. Now, I would like to say I had it with that attitude, but I tried to compose myself with that sweet hour of prayer attitude and pulled the student aside and said, do you realize your family was giving you the best they had? Well, I tell you, that bed was terrible. And again, I said, the family was giving you their very best. For the mother and father, whose bed it was, slept on the dirt floor with their children each evening because they wanted to provide the best hospitality that they could provide. It took a while for the message to sink in, but I think the student finally got it. The miracle of Jesus feeding 4,000, 5,000, 10,000, however many you imagine, is not about saying, okay, this is how it worked. That when people saw Jesus take bread, they all reached into their pockets and their baskets and they pulled out bread and fish and they all ate. I'm not denying it. It could have happened. But for me, the miracle is the impossibility of what can happen when we give, when we say we have nothing else to give. In Nicaragua, those families gave when really they had nothing else to give. Some of us felt guilty that they fed us breakfast every morning when we could have probably went back into town and bought something that some of us would have said tasted better. But it is the nothingness. It is those who have nothing giving more than they can. And I believe I've told you this story before of talking about my cynicism in a church committee meeting and saying, well, this is how I solve the problem. As I explained earlier, is that I will go grocery shopping with them, but I will not give them the money. And a woman who had been homeless and had lived a summer without electricity looked at me and said, "How dare you?" She said, "You have to accept them for who they are, and you have to trust. For God," as she said, "trust us with many things, and can't we just trust someone with just a few dollars?" She got me right here. And what do you say when everyone else is surrounding you, looking at you as this non-preacher probably preached the best sermon I've ever heard, and I took it to heart. But my friends, isn't the miracle about the impossibility that can happen when we say we have nothing, but we do have 3 fish, 5 loaves of bread, but we have a little bit more. Perhaps it is. The impossibility is it's not all about money. It's not all about food. It's about all that we have, for all the blessings God has given us, that we share in that abundance. So when Jesus was with his disciples in this moment, I think, as I've said, he was teaching them to believe the impossible, and even more, was teaching them to trust in their own abilities, for God had already given them the gifts. During her lifetime, Mother Teresa is said to have said these words: "Be the living expression of God's kindness. Kindness in your face, kindness in your eyes, kindness in your smile, kindness in your warm greeting. In the slums, we are the light of God's kindness to the poor, to the children, to the poor, to all who suffer and are lonely. Give always your happy smile. Give them not only your care, but give them your heart." Amen.